Claire Donovan had never been the kind of woman who fell easily into routine or comfort, and perhaps that was why she chose to base her agricultural business on land that most people had written off decades ago. The farm on the outskirts of Brookhaven had been standing half-abandoned for years, its faded fences leaning, its roof lines sagging, and its once proud barn weathered to the color of ash. Where others saw ruin, she saw potential, and where neighbors muttered about wasted soil and decaying timber, Claire saw the opportunity to create something durable, something that combined her passion for sustainable agriculture with her determination to prove that neglected land could be restored and repurposed. For Claire, the barn was not just another storage facility or architectural relic. It was a cornerstone of her project, a structure she had carefully reinforced to serve as a repository for seeds collected from all over the country, many of them heritage strains that had been disappearing under the weight of modern farming monocultures. She had invested money she could scarcely afford into climate control systems, custom shelving, and cataloging equipment. More than once she told her business partners that if her house burned down tomorrow, she would mourn less for her lost clothes and furniture than she would for the seeds in that barn, because they represented not only her future, but also the collective memory of past growers who had fought to preserve them. Her days were long, filled with work that many would consider punishing. She oversaw deliveries, maintained spreadsheets of inventory, tested soil samples, and walked the fields until her boots were caked with mud. At night, she would retreat into the barn with a thermos of tea and the faint hum of the cooling units, sitting at a desk near the north wall, reviewing her crop rotation plans and the upcoming schedules for germination tests. The barn, with its drafty beams and the faint smell of oil that lingered from decades of use, had become the place where she felt most at peace, a private sanctuary where the future of her farm and the very essence of her work were concentrated. While others found their sense of belonging in crowded meetings or through neighborhood dinners, Claire found hers under that roof of corrugated steel, among labeled jars of seeds and neat ledgers of numbers. Her relationship with the surrounding community had always been polite but distant. The neighborhood association, though technically irrelevant to her land since her property fell on the industrial border rather than the residential plots, liked to remind her of their presence. Now and then she would receive newsletters in her mailbox or even letters that suggested compliance with guidelines that were not legally binding on her acreage. She ignored them with the calm indifference of someone who knew her ground was secure, and yet a faint undercurrent of hostility simmered whenever she encountered certain neighbors at the farmer's market or in town. There were whispers that her operation was out of step with the image the community wanted to project, that her barn looked unsightly compared to manicured suburban lawns. Claire did not waste her breath arguing aesthetics with people who had never lifted a shovel, but she registered the unease behind their smiles and stored it quietly in the back of her mind, knowing that resentment, even when veiled, had a way of surfacing. That particular evening had been unremarkable, the kind of day where fatigue slipped over her shoulders like a heavy coat. A storm had rolled in with the night, rain hammering the tin roof of her farmhouse and rattling the windows in gusts, but Claire had grown used to such weather. She double-checked the generator, secured the shutters, and let the barn lights stay off, trusting the systems inside to run on their own. The barn was strong, reinforced after months of repairs, and she had no reason to imagine anything other than a typical morning awaiting her when the storm cleared. Yet, as she sat with her notebook in hand, half listening to the wind shift around the eaves, she felt a peculiar restlessness. It was the kind of unease that one dismisses easily, blaming the storm or too much caffeine, though in truth it was nothing external at all but rather a faint instinct that something beyond her control was already moving into place. When she finally went to bed, the sound of rain had become a dull lullaby, and fatigue overcame suspicion. She slept without dreams, unaware that while the storm washed the land clean, forces she neither invited nor understood were converging upon her barn. By the time the first thin light of dawn reached her window, Claire would no longer have the sanctuary she had spent years preserving. The barn that had been the heart of her work, The quiet centerpiece of her vision was gone, reduced to debris in the mud. And left behind, silent and unmoving in the morning haze, stood the machine that had done it, as though it had fallen asleep in the middle of its task, waiting for her to discover its presence. When Claire stepped outside the next morning, the air still smelled of wet iron from the storm, and the ground shone with a slick sheen that caught the pale light of dawn. She had expected to see the familiar silhouette of the barn standing firm against the horizon, weathered but dignified, the kind of shape her eyes sought automatically every morning, as if verifying the world was still aligned. Instead, her gaze met an emptiness so sharp it was almost disorienting. The barn was gone, not damaged, not partially collapsed under the weight of wind, but entirely erased, as though the earth had swallowed it during the night. All that remained was a sprawl of broken wood, metal fragments, and churned-up mud that gave off the sour smell of diesel. Her first instinct was that a tornado had swept through, but the rest of the property was untouched. The farmhouse stood whole. The fences were still crooked in their usual places, and the orchard trees were dripping with rain but otherwise unharmed. The destruction was precise, almost surgical, and her heart sank as her eyes moved toward the hulking form parked at the center of the devastation. A bulldozer, yellow paint streaked with mud, its engine quiet but its posture oddly defiant, sat abandoned like a beast that had finished feeding and was now resting. For several moments she could not move. She only stood there barefoot on the porch, the chill of the wood soaking through her skin, staring at the grotesque intruder that had stolen her sanctuary. The bulldozer looked both ordinary and impossible at once, as if it had materialized from some other reality. The cabin door hung ajar, and the keys were still in the ignition, dangling slightly in the breeze. No one was in sight. No tire marks suggested a crew of trucks had hauled it in or out, and the storm-washed mud revealed no fresh footprints. The machine was there without context, a remnant of the night's hidden labor. Claire's throat tightened, a cold surge of disbelief turning into anger, and yet beneath both emotions was the terrifying awareness that whoever had done this had not even tried to cover their tracks. It was as if the message was deliberate. We can come, we can destroy, and we do not need to explain. She forced her legs to move, walking slowly across the wet grass, each step heavy as though she were approaching a crime scene, which in truth she was. Her boots sank into the churned ground as she reached the wreckage, and the sight of what had once been her shelves of seeds and carefully catalogued crates, now reduced to twisted fragments, pierced her with such ferocity she almost staggered. Glass jars lay shattered, labels soaked and illegible, and the smell of earth mixed with oil filled her lungs. This was not vandalism, not an accident. This was an execution. Her hands trembled as she pulled her phone from her pocket, dialing the sheriff's office with a steadiness she did not feel. The deputy arrived nearly an hour later, a tired man in a rain-soaked jacket who stepped out of his cruiser with the weary gait of someone already expecting to dismiss her concerns. He walked the perimeter with a detached glance, jotted a few notes, and finally said in a voice so calm it was insulting, "Looks like a civil matter, Ms. Donovan. If a demolition crew came through by mistake, you'll want to take that up with the contractor. Our hands are tied unless there's proof of criminal intent proof." The word rang in her ears with bitter irony as she gestured toward the dozer that stood in the open like a confession. The deputy gave it a perfunctory look, shrugged, and suggested she call the county office to check permits. Then he left, tires splashing down the road, leaving Claire alone again with the machine that had erased her future in a single night. She climbed onto the bulldozer's step, gripping the metal rail, and peered inside. The cabin smelled faintly of smoke and something older, metallic, like rust hidden under polish. The seat was damp but intact, and the dashboard bore no company insignia, only a serial number etched into a plate so worn she could barely make it out. She took a photograph, though the rain-spotted lens blurred the numbers, and then climbed down, fighting the urge to smash the keys against the frame. Whoever had orchestrated this had left the machine as bait, daring her to act, daring her to claim it as evidence, daring her to accept that the destruction of her barn was not a mistake, but the opening move of a larger game. Throughout the morning, she made calls. The county zoning office, the Agricultural Extension Bureau, the building inspector's desk. Each time the answers came back the same. There were no records of demolition orders on her property, no contractors licensed to work in her area overnight, no municipal projects that could have justified heavy machinery rolling through her fields. One clerk even laughed nervously, asking if she was sure the barn had existed in the first place, as though the absence of paperwork could rewrite the past. By midday, Claire realized the paper trail had been carefully managed, erased in advance or never filed at all. The bulldozer, instead of clarifying the crime, deepened it, standing mute and inscrutable while the world around her insisted nothing irregular had happened. Her frustration grew into something darker when she remembered the occasional letters from the neighborhood association, the passive-aggressive reminders that her barn did not contribute positively to the community aesthetic. Those letters had always struck her as toothless, more nuisance than threat, but now they glowed in her memory with a sinister implication. If the HOA had overstepped, if they had somehow treated her barn as though it fell under their jurisdiction, then the bulldozer might be less mystery and more message, fall in line or be erased. Yet even that explanation faltered, because HOAS thrived on paperwork, on notices and warnings and hearings. This was different. This was silent, brutal, and efficient, the kind of action taken not by committees but by hands that wanted no negotiation. As the sun crept westward, she stood in the ruins of her barn with her fists clenched, mud streaking her jeans, staring at the machine that had committed the act yet refusing to reveal who had commanded it. She thought of the seeds lost, the work undone, the countless hours cataloging and preserving that now lay crushed under steel. Anger coursed through her, sharper than grief, because grief would have meant acceptance, and she was not ready to accept anything. Somewhere between the hum of the cooling units that no longer existed and the quiet whir of her phone recording the wreckage, Claire made a vow to herself. This would not end with the bulldozer standing as a monument to her defeat. Whoever had chosen the night and the storm as cover had underestimated her resolve. By evening, when the sky darkened again and the smell of diesel still clung to her hair, Claire realized she had crossed an invisible threshold. She was no longer a farmer mourning the loss of a building. She was a woman marked by intrusion, stripped of her sanctuary, and forced into a conflict she had never sought. And as the bulldozer sat immovable in the gloom, its silent presence became more than evidence. It became a reminder that she was being watched, measured, and tested, and that the real danger had only just begun. Claire had always prided herself on her ability to keep emotion and logic balanced, but as the hours after the destruction turned into days, she found her patience tested in ways she had never experienced before. The bulldozer remained on her land like an unwanted monument, and every morning when she stepped outside, she saw its heavy shadow stretching across the wreckage of her barn, mocking her with silence. She had reported it again and again, first to the sheriff's office, then to the county, then even to the State Transportation Bureau, and every answer was a variation of the same shrug. No one claimed it, no one admitted responsibility. No one could explain why the machine had been there or how it had entered her property without leaving any supporting records. Bureaucracy disguised its own incompetence as inevitability, and by the third day she realized that if she wanted answers, she would have to dig them out herself. Her first step was to call the number etched into the side of the machine, a faint and partially eroded stencil with the name of a construction company she vaguely recognized from signs along highways. The receptionist on the other end sounded confused, placed her on hold for nearly half an hour, and finally transferred her to a manager who spoke with the tone of someone already preparing to dismiss a nuisance. He insisted that none of their equipment was scheduled in her county, much less on her property, and that the bulldozer she described had been decommissioned 2 years earlier. When she pressed for details, citing the serial number she had photographed, he went silent, then muttered something about misfiled records and abruptly ended the call. The abruptness of it sent a jolt of recognition through her. This was not ignorance, but evasion, the carefully measured distance of someone under orders not to reveal too much. That night she walked the property with a lantern, tracing the churned mud and the faint grooves left by the dozer's treads. To her surprise, the marks didn't lead toward the main road but instead curved sharply behind the tree line, disappearing into a forgotten track that had once been an access lane for delivery trucks decades ago. Overgrown with weeds and saplings, the lane should have been impassable, yet the bulldozer had come through it as though guided by hands familiar with its contours. Following it further, she realized the trail ended abruptly near the boundary where her land bordered parcels technically managed by the Homeowners Association. A section of fence had been removed and replaced, the soil tamped carefully down, as if someone had gone out of their way to erase the signs of entry. The implication was clear. Whoever operated the bulldozer had come not from a random contractor's yard or the county depot, but from the very community that had spent years complaining about her barn. Her suspicion grew into certainty the next morning when she received a certified envelope in the mail, the kind stamped with officious lettering that always carried the odor of manipulation. Inside was a letter from the HOA board, written in the infuriatingly polished tone of bureaucrats who believed that politeness could disguise cruelty. It stated that, due to ongoing safety concerns and complaints from neighboring residents, the association has taken steps to remove hazardous and non-compliant structures from community-adjacent parcels. The language was slippery, deliberately vague, and yet it stopped just short of admitting that they had demolished her barn. When she called the number on the letterhead, demanding to speak to the board president, she was told in a clipped voice that she was not technically a member of the association, and therefore had no standing to contest their actions in community hearings. That paradox enraged her more than anything else. They had claimed authority to destroy her property while simultaneously declaring she had no voice in questioning them. She drove to the association's office the same afternoon, a sterile building tucked behind a row of manicured shops where the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and ambition. The receptionist, a woman with an immovable smile, asked her to wait, and after 20 minutes she was ushered into a small conference room where the president, a man named Douglas Harlan, sat with a folder already open in front of him. His calm demeanor and precise gestures suggested he had rehearsed the conversation long before she arrived. He told her the barn had been flagged repeatedly in anonymous complaints, described as unsafe, unsightly, and potentially in violation of new municipal codes that required compliance with fire regulations. Claire countered with every fact she had, explaining the renovations she had performed, the structural integrity reports she had filed with the county, and the documented exemption that placed her property outside the HOA's jurisdiction. Harlan listened with a kind of cold patience, then leaned back in his chair and said with faint amusement that rules had a way of evolving. When she demanded to know under what law they had the right to send a bulldozer onto her land in the middle of the night, his smile hardened into something sharper. He claimed ignorance, suggesting the demolition company had acted prematurely, perhaps misunderstanding instructions, and that she should address her grievances to them. The dance of deflection was masterful, each phrase carefully designed to acknowledge nothing, to shift responsibility away from his hands while keeping the threat implicit. Claire felt the blood rise in her face as she realized she was not speaking to a bureaucrat overwhelmed by mistakes, but to a man deliberately cloaked in plausible deniability. The barn was gone, and they had orchestrated its disappearance with the confidence that she would never be able to untangle the threads of accountability. As she left the building, fury simmering beneath her skin, she noticed two board members standing in the hallway, whispering to one another as their eyes tracked her departure. Their smirks were small but undeniable, the smugness of people convinced they had silenced an irritant. The sight steeled her resolve. They thought she would back down, overwhelmed by the cost of legal battles and the impossibility of chasing shadows through the maze of property law. They thought she would accept the loss and quietly rebuild somewhere else. But Claire knew something they did not. She had nothing left to lose but the truth, and she was prepared to drag it into the light even if it meant tearing through the walls they had so carefully constructed. That night, back on her property, she stood once more before the bulldozer, its presence looming like a sentinel. The machine was not simply evidence, it was leverage, a physical fact that could not be explained away by polished letters or evasive smiles. Whoever had abandoned it had miscalculated. It had become her weapon, her unmovable witness. She placed her hand on the cold steel, inhaled the diesel scent that lingered in the air, and whispered to herself words she had never spoken aloud before. If they wanted a war, they found it. Claire had never been a woman prone to illusions of fairness, yet even with all her cynicism she found herself stunned by the way the weeks unfolded after the bulldozer appeared and the barn vanished. The association's letter remained pinned on her refrigerator door, the language so slick it almost glistened with the varnish of legal protection, and every time she reread the phrases about hazardous, non-compliant structures, she felt her throat tighten with a mixture of rage and disbelief. Her barn had been legal, documented, inspected, and in good condition. She had the papers, the reports, the signatures of county engineers who had walked the beams and approved every upgrade. What she lacked, however, was the ability to make those papers louder than the silence of a powerful board determined to erase her claim. The bulldozer still squatted on her land, and though she had called in requests for removal, no company arrived to take it away. No government department claimed it, and each day it remained felt like a deliberate reminder that she was not in control of her own ground. Her lawyer, a sharp but exhausted woman named Lydia Harmon, listened with furrowed brows as Claire laid out every detail. Lydia had handled property disputes before, but she admitted this one was strange, even by the standards of petty power plays and overreaching HOAs. She spread Claire's documents across the table in her office, tapping the exemption papers, the renovation approvals, the zoning maps, and shook her head at the absurdity. "They can't just treat your land as if it's theirs," Lydia said, her voice low but firm. "And they definitely can't orchestrate a demolition without notice, not without permits, not without the county signing off." Yet, when she contacted the county office for confirmation, she discovered something that shifted the entire situation into darker territory. Claire's parcel had been quietly reclassified 3 months earlier, folded into a redevelopment zone through a clerical adjustment that carried no public hearing and no warning. On the new map, her property appeared shaded as part of a community enhancement corridor, a designation that gave the HOA leverage to argue that structures interfering with aesthetic or safety goals could be removed under emergency authorization. The discovery hit Claire like a stone in the chest. She demanded to know how it was possible, and Lydia explained in careful words that the law allowed such reclassifications under certain development initiatives, usually filed by planning committees in coordination with neighborhood boards. When Claire asked who had requested this reclassification, the answer was both predictable and chilling. The petition had been submitted by none other than the HOA president, Douglas Harlan, under the pretense of aligning industrial parcels with residential growth. The county clerk who processed it probably hadn't even questioned the paperwork, rubber stamping it because it appeared routine. Claire wanted to scream, because she had never received a notice, never seen a sign posted, never been given a chance to object. Her land had been transformed on paper into something it was not, and that falsehood had been weaponized to erase her barn in reality. Lydia suggested they dig deeper, not into the association directly, but into the redevelopment corridor itself. Together they pored over minutes from county meetings, scanned through obscure subcommittee reports, and traced names attached to funding allocations. What emerged was not a neat conspiracy but a web of overlapping interests. Developers proposing new housing complexes, contractors vying for bids, and, curiously, a construction firm that kept appearing on multiple lists despite having supposedly been inactive for several years. The name matched the one faintly stenciled on Claire's Bulldozer. The firm had not filed taxes recently, had no public-facing projects, and yet it was receiving small but steady payments from accounts tied to the HOA's discretionary budget. It was not proof, not yet, but it was the outline of a scheme, an arrangement in which the association used a defunct company as a phantom contractor, allowing them to deploy equipment under the guise of legitimacy while maintaining deniability. The deeper they dug, the more inconsistencies surfaced. One zoning map placed her boundary 40 feet east of its true marker, a shift that conveniently excluded her barn from protection. An environmental report claimed her structure was infested with black mold, citing samples from a building that did not match her dimensions. And in the county records office, Lydia unearthed a demolition order stamped with Claire's address but bearing a signature from an inspector who had retired 2 years earlier. The document was not merely suspicious, it was fraudulent, an invention slipped into the file to create the illusion of legality. Claire stared at the photocopy in numb silence, realizing for the first time that this was not simply about her barn being an eyesore. This was about calculated theft of land, the rewriting of records to create a paper reality where her existence was already erased. The weight of it nearly broke her that evening when she returned to the farm. She walked the perimeter as the sun sank behind the trees, her boots dragging through mud that still bore the imprints of treads, and for a moment she considered surrender. The barn was gone, the seeds ruined, her credibility eroded by false reports, and the men behind it all sat in clean offices where their pens carried more authority than her voice. But as she stood before the bulldozer, its silent bulk casting long shadows across the rubble, she felt something shift inside her. The machine was their mistake. In their arrogance, they had left behind a relic, a piece of evidence too large to disappear quietly, a piece of steel that testified louder than forged signatures and manipulated maps. It was her anchor, her witness, and she realized that if she could trace its origins, prove its deployment had been unauthorized, she might not only expose their fraud, but unravel the entire scheme. So she began cataloging everything. She photographed the cereal plates, scraped paint chips to send to a lab, and even collected soil samples from beneath the tracks, hoping they would show traces of where it had traveled before arriving on her land. She documented the false reports, highlighted discrepancies in the zoning maps, and compiled testimony from neighbors who swore they had never filed complaints despite their names appearing on the HOA's petitions. Piece by piece, she built a dossier that transformed her grief into strategy. Lydia reviewed the growing file with cautious optimism, warning her that legal battles would be long and expensive, but admitting that the evidence was beginning to resemble something formidable. The midpoint of her struggle was not a single revelation, but the accumulation of many small truths that formed a picture too sharp to ignore. Her barn had not been destroyed by accident, nor by overzealous enforcers misreading bylaws. It had been targeted deliberately, its erasure orchestrated through fraudulent paperwork and ghost companies, all designed to clear her land for someone else's gain. And standing at the center of it all, silent and immovable, was the bulldozer that had done the work, a machine that should not have been there, a machine that carried within it the fingerprints of those who believed themselves untouchable. Claire looked at it not with despair, but with a grim kind of determination. They had thought they buried her in mud and splinters. Instead, they had left her a weapon. The weeks after Claire and Lydia uncovered the fraudulent records became a descent into a deeper and more aggressive stage of conflict, as if the mere act of poking at the foundation of the association's scheme had triggered a reflexive counterattack. At first it was subtle. Letters arriving in Claire's mailbox accusing her of late tax filings, citations for noise violations even though her land had been silent since the barn was demolished, and anonymous complaints logged with the county health office suggesting her soil contained unsafe levels of contaminants. None of these claims held water, yet they forced her to waste hours on calls and paperwork, pushing her deeper into exhaustion. When she confronted Lydia with the mounting distractions, the lawyer's expression hardened. "They want to bury you in procedure," she said, "so that by the time you finally make it into court, you're already drained of time, money, and energy." Claire understood, but understanding did not diminish the strain of facing fire from every direction. One morning she woke to the sight of a fire smoldering near the remains of the barn, smoke curling into the dawn sky. Someone had piled debris into a crude pyre and ignited it, as if trying to eliminate what little evidence remained of the building's interior. She stamped out the embers with a hose, coughing from the acrid stench of burnt timber mixed with fuel, and discovered that several crates of seed fragments she had set aside for salvage had been taken. It was not vandalism by bored teenagers. It was methodical removal, the targeting of anything that could prove what the barn had contained. She installed new locks on her gates, but the intrusion was not about fences. It was about power, about reminding her that walls and locks meant nothing to people who had already rewritten maps to pretend her land belonged to them. That same week, Lydia filed motions to contest the fraudulent demolition order, attaching the discrepancies they had collected, but the court calendar moved slowly, deliberately, as if weighted by invisible hands. In the meantime, the association launched its own counterstrike, filing a lawsuit accusing Claire of obstruction of community safety initiatives and claiming she had knowingly stored hazardous biological material on her property. The accusation stunned her, not only because it was false but because it revealed a chilling truth. Someone within the board must have known exactly what her barn had housed, and they had twisted that knowledge into a weapon. Heritage seeds were now rebranded as dangerous, the act of preservation distorted into recklessness, and though she knew the claim would eventually collapse under scrutiny, she also knew that public perception often hardened long before facts had their day in court. Her nights became restless, her sleep broken by the sense of being watched. Several times she noticed headlights lingering on the far road, switching off when she stepped onto the porch. Once she found tire tracks across her orchard, too deliberate to be an accident, as if someone had circled the property to test her boundaries. The bulldozer remained, its presence a strange paradox, both a weapon in her favor and a target for those who wanted it gone. When she returned home one evening, she saw that someone had attempted to siphon fuel from its tank, leaving behind a discarded hose. The machine was no longer just a symbol of her loss. It had become contested ground, a relic both sides wanted to control. Frustration grew into a hardened edge of defiance when she received notice that the association had petitioned the county to authorize removal of unclaimed heavy equipment from her land. The irony nearly made her laugh, though it was bitter laughter because the very bulldozer they had abandoned was now being described as abandoned by her, as if they could erase their mistake by framing her as negligent. Lydia advised filing an injunction immediately, which they did, but Claire knew the attempt signaled a new stage. The association was no longer content to deny responsibility. They were actively trying to destroy the one piece of tangible proof tying them to the demolition. It was during this period of escalating tension that Claire began to notice fractures in the silence of her neighbors. A woman named Ruth, who lived 2 streets over and had always kept her distance, approached her quietly at the market and whispered that she remembered seeing trucks late at night heading toward Claire's property. Another man, a retired electrician, admitted he had been asked to sign a complaint against Claire's barn months earlier, but had refused because he had never even set foot on her land. Their voices were small, hesitant, weighed down by fear of reprisal, yet each one confirmed what Claire had begun to suspect. The association's campaign was not just against her but part of a larger pattern of coercion, targeting anyone who resisted. The tidy picture of community expansion. The second escalation was not a single act of violence, but an accumulation of pressure, each tactic designed to grind her resolve into submission. Her accounts were flagged with sudden audits, her shipments of farm supplies delayed without explanation, and at one point she discovered that her insurance policy had been abruptly canceled on the grounds of structural negligence. It was a suffocating assault of paper, fire, and intimidation, and yet through it all she held to one thought that kept her from collapse. The bulldozer was still there. Every time she looked at it, she remembered that their scheme was not airtight, that they had left behind something they could not easily erase, and that so long as it remained, she had leverage. One night, as she walked the perimeter with a flashlight, she caught the glint of eyes in the trees, someone retreating at the edge of her property. She did not chase them. Instead, she returned to the bulldozer, rested her hand on its cold steel, and felt a strange surge of resolve. They had escalated. They had tried to bury her. They had turned her life into a maze of traps, but she was still standing. The war was no longer about a barn, or seeds, or even land. It was about whether one determined woman could hold her ground against an entity that believed it could rewrite reality at will. And as the night settled heavy around her, Claire whispered into the silence that she would not bend. Not now. Not ever. The court date finally arrived under a sky so heavy with gray that Claire felt as though the weather itself had been summoned to press down on her resolve. But instead of breaking, she found herself sharpened by it, every drop of rain tapping against. The courthouse windows a reminder of what had been taken from her and why she could not afford to falter. Lydia stood beside her with a folder so thick it seemed to bow under its own weight, filled with every scrap of evidence they had managed to pry from reluctant offices, every inconsistency in the zoning maps, every affidavit from neighbors who had finally gathered the courage to admit they had been pressured into signing complaints that were not their own. On the other side of the room sat Douglas Harlan and two board members, their suits pressed into perfect lines, their expressions calm to the point of arrogance, as though this were nothing more than another meeting where paperwork would carry the day. They brought their own counsel, a man who spoke with a voice like polished marble, trying to bury the proceedings in language so ornate it almost obscured the lack of truth behind it. The judge, however, was not blind to theater, and when Lydia laid out the demolition order with the forged inspector's signature, the air in the room shifted. She spoke not with anger, but with precision, each word delivered like a scalpel, pointing out the impossibility of a retired official authorizing an overnight operation, noting the absence of permit filings, and then producing photographs of the bulldozer with its mismatched serial plates. When she revealed that the company allegedly responsible for the demolition had been dissolved years earlier, even the clerk in the corner stopped shuffling papers to stare. Claire watched Harlan closely through all of this, and though he tried to maintain composure, she caught the small tightening of his jaw when Lydia presented the payment records linking association funds to the Phantom Company. It was the first crack in his mask, and it fueled her like oxygen. Their lawyer countered with claims of emergency safety concerns, arguing that the barn had posed a risk of collapse, that dangerous biological material had been stored inside, that the association had acted in the community's best interest. But Lydia struck back by producing the inspection reports signed by county engineers only months earlier, documents confirming the structure's stability. Then she revealed affidavits from agricultural specialists verifying that the seeds Claire stored were not hazardous waste, but certified heritage crops. The accusations collapsed under the weight of contradiction, and for the first time Harlan's lawyer faltered, his words tangling in the air as the judge pressed him for clarification he could not provide. The climax came when Lydia called Claire to the stand. Her voice did not tremble as she described the night of the storm, the morning she stepped outside to find her barn erased, and the sight of the bulldozer standing in the mud like a monument to arrogance. She spoke of the letters, the harassment, the false records, the fires lit to destroy what little evidence remained, and though she kept her tone measured, the raw grief and determination behind her words filled the room more powerfully than any. Exhibit. When she finished, the silence was thick, broken only by the judge's pen scratching across the page as he recorded notes with deliberate gravity. By the end of the day, the ruling was delivered, and though the legal phrasing was cautious, the weight of it was undeniable. The demolition had been unlawful. The association had exceeded its authority, falsified records, and engaged in actions that demanded referral for further investigation. The court ordered restitution for the destruction of Claire's barn, mandated that the bulldozer be seized as evidence, and recommended that the county prosecutor review the matter for potential criminal charges. Harlan's composure cracked fully then, his hand tightening on the table until his knuckles whitened, his gaze fixed on Claire with something between fury and disbelief, as if he had never considered that the woman whose land he had erased would actually stand against him and win. As Claire stepped out of the courthouse into the rain, she did not feel triumph in the simple sense, because the barn was still gone and nothing could restore the years of work crushed under steel. But she felt something deeper, a vindication that the truth had been carved into the record where no amount of bureaucratic maneuvering could erase it. The association had been forced into the light, and though the fight ahead would continue in investigations and appeals, the climax of her struggle had arrived in that room, where the machinery of power had been forced to admit its own corruption. And as she walked back to her car, soaked but unbowed, she knew that the battle had shifted irrevocably. No longer her against a faceless entity, but her voice against men whose names and deeds had been written down for judgment. In the weeks following the ruling, Claire felt the strange quiet that descends after a storm. Not the peaceful kind that brings rest, but the heavy silence of aftermath when debris still litters the ground and the air carries the memory of thunder. The bulldozer was finally removed from her property, loaded onto a flatbed under the watch of the county officials, its presence no longer looming over her land, yet leaving behind the ghost of its shadow. She stood by as it was taken, not with relief, but with a kind of solemn recognition that even in victory she had been changed, that she could never return to the simplicity of walking across her farm without remembering the night her sanctuary was. Stolen. Restitution came in the form of a financial award that looked large on paper but felt hollow in her hands, because money could not reconstruct the years of trust and labor that had vanished with the barn. Yet she accepted it, not because it healed anything, but because it was a marker of accountability, proof that her voice had been heard in a system that had been designed to ignore it. The association fractured under the weight of exposure. Several members resigned quietly, unwilling to withstand the scrutiny of neighbors who now looked at them not as guardians of order, but as conspirators in an overreach that had gone too far. Harlan himself remained defiant, promising appeals and dismissing the judgment as political, but Claire no longer feared him. His power had been drawn from secrecy and arrogance, and now both had been pierced. Investigations into financial misconduct spread beyond her case, revealing a pattern of shadow deals and misused funds, and for the first time, the community began to question not her presence, but the authority of those who had tried to erase her. Claire walked her land in the evenings, the wreckage cleared, the ground leveled, and though the barn was gone, she began to sketch plans for a new structure, not identical, never a replica, but something that carried the memory of what she had lost, without trying to pretend it could be restored. Neighbors who once watched from a distance now stopped to offer words of support, some embarrassed for their silence, others quietly relieved that someone had dared to confront what they had endured in smaller ways. She listened, accepted their words without judgment, and allowed herself to feel the strange solidarity that grew from shared recognition of abuse. The resolution was not triumphant in the way of stories where villains are toppled and heroes return unscathed. It was quieter, steadier, more realistic. A woman standing on her land, scarred by betrayal but unbroken, aware that the barn was gone forever, yet determined that its destruction would not define her future. What defined her was the decision to fight when silence would have been easier, to dig into the soil of corruption and expose it, and to stand unflinching before those who believed they could write her out of existence. And as the last traces of the bulldozer's weight faded from the earth, Claire felt a strange certainty that though she had not chosen this war, she had finished it on her terms, and that was enough.